From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. My name is Georgette Dorn, and I'm the chief of the Hispanic Division. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor Egginton at the Library of Congress and to this wonderful, wonderful crowd. Please close all your electronic devices so we can hear the speaker very well. And I want to thank the Poetry and Literature Center for co-sponsoring this event, especially Rob Casper, his director, and Anya Kreitney. And of course, Talia Guzman-Gonzalez, who organized this event. And it's Talia who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Talia Guzman-Gonzalez, and I'm a reference librarian and Luso-Brazilian specialist in the Hispanic Division. I would like to welcome you all to the Library of Congress, your library, I like to say. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I would like to thank the good people at the Poetry and Literature Center, the director, Robert Casper, and the program specialist, Anya Kreitney, and their intern for helping us with the co-sponsorship and setting up the room. My colleagues in the Hispanic Division, especially Catalina Gomez and our chief, Georgette Dorn, also deserve a big thank you for their support and help in sorting out all the details for making this event possible. Today we have the honor to welcome Professor William Egginton for what I'm sure will be a fascinating lecture on Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra and the art of fiction. This talk is the third and last in a series of events celebrating the life and work of Cervantes in the 400th year of his death. In case you missed any of our previous events, you can visit our webpage for the webcast and of those events and many other great talks that we organized in the Hispanic Division. Professor Egginton is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities and Chair of the Department of German and Romance Languages and Literatures at Johns Hopkins University, where he teaches Spanish and Latin American literature, literary theory, and the relation between literature and philosophy. He is also the director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute at Hopkins. Professor Egginton's body of work is a testament to the erudition of a true scholar. His breadth and depth of research demonstrates originality, theoretical strength, and passion. He is the author of How the World Became a Stage, Presence, Theatricality, and the Question of Modernity, which is based on his dissertation at Stanford University under the direction of Hans Ulrich Gombrich, and Perversity and Ethics, A Wrinkle in History, The Philosopher's Desire, The Theater of Truth, and In Defense of Religious Moderation. He is also the co-editor with Mike Sandbooth of The Pragmatic Turn in Philosophy, the translator of Lisa Bloch de Beher's Borges, The Passion of an Endless Quotation, and the co-editor with David E. Johnson of Thinking with Borges. And I want to take this opportunity that he's also the author of several Borges books and articles, that we're going to have a talk with Maria Kodama next week on Wednesday at 6:30. He's also the author of numerous articles and book chapters and the contributor of, for the New York Times online forum, The Stone, which is fascinating. And he has written on topics ranging from neuroscience, law, and zombies. There's a great title there. He's here today to talk about his most recent work, The Man Who Invented Fiction, How Cervantes Ushered in the Modern World, published in 2016, an indication that some good things did happen in 2016, for sure. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Egginton.
Thank you, Georgette. Thank you, Talia, and all the colleagues at the Library of Congress. It's an honor and a real pleasure to be here. I've visited our library before, but never in this capacity, and it's a real honor, as I say. One brief note, just because it's so hot off the press, David Castillo and I just published our book, Mediologies, Reading Reality in the Age of Inflationary Media. which had the distinction, it came out 2 weeks ago, as someone pointed out on Twitter soon thereafter, of having, we started writing it 3 or 4 years ago, all of our political examples were in fact about Donald Trump, with no knowledge even that he was going to declare himself as a candidate. So it's an analysis of media practices in the 20th and 21st century from the framework of media revolutions 400 years ago. So the idea that the grounds were laid for this kind of political turmoil 400 years ago is an interesting one, and certainly thought-provoking. So what I plan to do today is the sound good for everyone in the room? Yeah? Is a reading from the man who invented fiction. It'll probably be 45 or 50 minutes. I'll jump around a little bit here and there in the book and accompany it with some images. Some of them are in the book, others supplement that. Most of the images, if not all, have come from the George Peabody Library, our collection of rare books at Baltimore, which I decided to focus on in my research. We have such great collections from 17th and 16th century Spanish literature that I thought this was a resource that really needed to be brought to the public eye. So, without further ado, I'll get into it. Something strange happened in the winter of 1605. At the heart of the world's most powerful empire, in a time of economic decline and political stagnation, word started spreading about, of all things, a book. The dealers quickly sold out. Those who could read passed increasingly threadbare copies from hand to hand, and those who could not read began to congregate in inns, village squares, and taverns to hear those pages read aloud. Packed in tightly around worn wooden tables, clutching goblets of acrid wine and warmed by a smoky hearth, those fortunate enough to be in attendance when a literate benefactor declaimed the opening words were not treated to an epic rendering of heroic deeds, a lyrical paean to a shepherd's love, or a pious reflection on the martyrdom of a beloved saint. Instead, as they washed back their dregs and squeezed in closer to get a better seat, they were among the first to hear these now immortal opening words. Somewhere in La Mancha, in a place whose name I do not care to remember, a gentleman lived not long ago. It would not be long, in fact, until the tipsy crowd was cackling in delight over the misadventures of what would become world literature's most recognizable protagonist. A rickety, geriatric member of the lower gentry who, foolish enough to have traded in much of his land for countless books of chivalry, quote, became so caught up in reading that he spent his nights reading from dusk till dawn and his days reading from sunrise to sunset, and with too little sleep and too much reading, his brains dried up, causing him to lose his mind. In this state the pitiful gentleman has, quoting again, the strangest thought any lunatic in the world ever had, which was that it seemed reasonable and necessary for him, both for the sake of his honor and as a service to the nation, to become a knight-errant and travel the world with his armor and his horse to seek adventures and engage in everything he had heard that knight-errants engage in, righting all manners of wrong, and by seizing the opportunity and placing himself in danger and righting those wrongs, winning eternal renown and everlasting fame." End quote. How they howled with laughter as they heard for the first time the exploits of this ridiculous geezer, wandering a countryside they recognized as their own, and coming face to face with the kinds of people they spent their days with, the kinds of people they were likely rubbing shoulders with as they listened to this tale. Mule drivers and scullery maids, farmers and prostitutes, barbers and innkeepers. For the first half hour, our tavern crowd is treated to the circus it came for. The aging madman mistakes a shabby inn for a castle, its owner for a noble knight, and two common wenches for exquisite ladies. He requests the boon of an official dubbing from the wily innkeeper, who knows his tales of chivalry enough to keep in character, even as the hapless hero wreaks havoc on his guests and provokes giggles in the ladies of easy virtue. As he chastises a farmer for beating his servant, but then trusts in his chivalry enough to send them off together again with a mere promise of recompense, to the farmer's sly delight and the servant's enduring agony. The story our tavern crowd is hearing, in other words, is pure and bawdy satire, an unbridled ribbing of an impoverished and degenerate gentry anesthetized by the cliched literature of a previous century. Well into their second or third round of libations, our tavern-goers hear how the aged gentleman comes to realize he's missing something, and resolves, quote, to return to his house and outfit himself with everything, including a squire, thinking he would take on a neighbor of his, a peasant who was poor and had children, but was very well suited to the chivalric occupation of a squire. At home for 2 weeks, the delusional knight convinces his peasant neighbor to join him, promising him, upon completion of their quest, an island, which he insists on calling, in proper epic form, by its Latinate name, an insula, insouciant to the geographically inconvenient fact that they are wandering around the arid plains of central Spain, many days' travel from any significant body of water. The introduction of this stout, simple neighbor changes everything, for the listeners in the tavern and for us, their literary descendants. Until Don Quixote seeks out Sancho Panza, for these, of course, are the characters I've been describing, he is but a foil, a rube, a brilliantly crafted one, to be sure, but nonetheless an object of derision that our fellow tavern fellows would feel comfortable ridiculing. At the time of the writing, the mentally ill were protected from prosecution from certain crimes, but they were not protected from abuse, marginalization, and being used as the butt of the joke for a populace starved for entertainment. Having found Sancho Panza, though, Quixote suddenly becomes something quite different. Within a page or two of setting off together, the two companions encounter their most iconic adventure. Good fortune is guiding our affairs better than we could have desired, for you see here, Sancho, 30 or more enormous giants with whom I intend to do battle, and whose lives I intend to take. And with the spoils we shall now begin to grow rich, for this is righteous warfare, and it is a great service to God to remove so evil a breed from the face of the earth. What giants? Said Sancho Panza. Those over there, replied his master, with the long arms. Sometimes they're almost 2 leagues long. Look, your grace, Sancho responded. Those things that appear over there aren't giants, but windmills, and what looks like their arms are the sails that are turned by the wind and make the grindstone move. Predictably, famously, Don Quixote does not heed his good squire's common sense admonitions, but instead charges ahead, spearing the enormous sail of a windmill's arm with his lance, and being lifted, horse and all, off the ground and smashed back down in a miserable, aching heap. Sancho's reaction to his mishap, though, is different from those that greeted all his previous antics. Where the others treated Quixote as a spectacle, an entertainment, or a nuisance, Sancho responds with compassion. Seeing his master lying next to his fallen horse and shattered lance, Sancho, quote, hurried to help him as fast as his donkey could carry him. And when he reached them, he discovered that Don Quixote could not move because he had taken so hard a fall on Rocinante. God save me, said Sancho. Didn't I tell your grace to watch what you were doing, that these were nothing but windmills, and only somebody whose head was full of them wouldn't know that? From the limited outlook of his own simplicity, Sancho sees his master fail, sees the calamitous consequences of his delusions, and yet decides to accept him despite them. Quoting again, "It's in God's hands," said Sancho. "I believe everything your grace says, but sit a little straighter. It looks like you're tilting. It must be the battering that you took." In the space of a few pages, what had started as an exercise in comic ridicule and, as the narrator insists on several occasions, a satirical send-up of the tales of chivalry, has taken on an entirely different dimension. It has begun to transform itself into the story of a relationship between two characters whose incompatible takes on the world are bridged by friendship, loyalty, and eventually love. When deep in the second part, published 10 years after the first, a mischievous duchess elicits Sancho's confession that he does indeed know that Quixote is mad, and then accuses him of being, quote, more of a madman and a dimwit than his master for following him. Sancho replies, "If I were a clever man, I would have left my master days ago. But this is my fate, and this is my misfortune. I can't help it. I have to follow him. We're from the same village. I've eaten his bread. I love him dearly. He's a grateful man. He gave me his donkeys, and more than anything else, I'm faithful. So it's impossible for anything to separate us except the man with his pick and shovel." As the great German scholar Erich Auerbach wrote of Sancho's attachment to Quixote, the former, quote, learns from him and refuses to part from him. In Don Quixote's company, he becomes cleverer and better than he was before, end quote. The firelight flickering across the faces of our eager listeners registers no pall cast by this change. The raucous tavern crowd continues to laugh as before, but as the innkeeper shouts for last call and starts to close up shop, as the stragglers put down their empty cups and make for the door, chattering about the tale and making plans to return the next evening so as not to miss what happens next, something imperceptible to them has happened. The crowd that arrived that first evening was used to ridicule. They were fluent in the language of satire. With Don Quixote, they were learning a new language. Today we call that language fiction. Most of us, if asked, would probably define fiction as an untrue story we read for entertainment in full knowledge that it's not true. And certainly that much is accurate. But think about what actually happens to us when our eyes start reading the words on the page or the characters in our favorite shows start to interact with one another. In a memorable scene from F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, Nick Carraway's mind drifts out of the apartment where he's entangled in some debauchery and imagines how, quote, high over the city, our line of yellow windows must have contributed their share of human secrecy to the casual watcher in the darkening streets. And I saw him too, looking up and wondering. I was within and without, simultaneously enchanted by and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life, end quote. Like Nick, when we engage with fiction, we are both within and without the story we are reading or watching. We are simultaneously ourselves, locked into our own particular view on the world, and someone else, maybe even someone very different from ourselves, feeling how he or she inhabits a very different world from ours. And like Nick, we can, on the pages of our book or on the screen before our eyes, be simultaneously enchanted and repelled by the inexhaustible variety of life. That ability to experience different and at times even contradictory realities without rejecting one or the other is one of the main reasons we are drawn to fiction in all of its forms. About a half year before, on a hot August day in 1604, a man walked through the dusty streets of Valladolid, Spain, clutching in his right hand a heavy package. In the absence of any authentic portraits, we must trust his own words to know that he was brown-haired and silver-bearded, with an aquiline, but well-proportioned, he adds, nose, and cheerful eyes partly hidden behind a pair of smeared spectacles, not shown in this 19th century rendition here, resembling, in the words of one of his literary rivals, badly fried eggs. Of medium build and missing most of his teeth, which was common enough in those times for a man just shy of 60 years, he had lost the use of his left hand many years earlier when he was hit by a harquebus shot while boarding a Turkish galleon at the Battle of Lepanto. His clothes, from the wide, rough collar around his neck to the tight stockings exposing the hardened muscles of his calves, would have broadcast to his fellow pedestrians his status as a member of the gentry, just as their ragged state would have advertised his rather precarious financial straits. Even though only recently arrived, the man would hardly have been a stranger to his neighbors in Valladolid's meatpacking quarter, the Rastro de Carneros, where he and his extended family occupied the floor above a raucous tavern. The Rastro was on the outskirts of a town that in 1604 could not keep pace with its exploding population. The rush of newcomers driven by the transfer of King Philip III's court from Madrid 4 years earlier, had brought new life and glamour to Valladolid. But it had also imposed a severe housing crisis. While the government tried to control growth and crowding by issuing zoning laws limiting the city's brightly colored buildings to 2 stories, the city's savvy landlords responded by constructing houses with hidden stories in the back. Thus, this motley family was not alone in the landlord Juan de Navas's house. All told, there were some 20 tenants living in its 13 rooms, almost all of them friends or relations of Miguel de Cervantes. As the aging soldier stepped gingerly over the rivulets of blood and offal that cut through the district's packed dirt and stone streets, his one good arm hugged that heavy package tightly to his chest. In it were hundreds of sheets of paper, each sheet packed to the margins with a neat, slanted hand of a professional scribe. Cervantes' own more rounded, slightly meandering script, which would have overflowed the many more hundreds of pages of his blotted, scratched, and corrected manuscripts, can only be seen today on a few precious remnants. A signed document from his 1597 stay in Seville's municipal jail, where it is thought that he first dreamt up Don Quixote, and a letter to the Archbishop of Toledo, shown here. The very prologue, whose words he penned only days before, both speaks to his evident concern that he be too closely associated with the book, and bears witness to the style of writing that its pages initiated. Though I seem to be the father, he tells his idle reader, I am the stepfather of Don Quixote. And then he proceeds to inform the reader that he won't beg him to ignore or forgive the book's faults because, quote, you have a soul in your body and a will as free as anyone's. And you are in your own house, where you are lord, as the sovereign is master of his revenues. And you know the old saying, under the cover of my cloak, I can kill the king. If the book seems to be, to you, readers, critical of society, if it appears to you to be saying the wrong kind of thing, Cervantes seems to be telling his readers, that's your responsibility. You are free to judge not only the book, but the world you live in, free to resist, free to revolt against the values you've been forced to believe in, and most shockingly, in a prologue approved under the royal seal, under the cloak of your own thoughts, you are free to kill the king himself. Cervantes, a valiant soldier and a committed Christian, had changed over a lifetime of disappointments. He had grown weary and wary of his country's vaunted certainties, cynical of its promises. But while he could never openly accuse the crown and Spanish society of hypocrisy, of deceit, of having abandoned all true values and noble virtues in exchange for a tissue of false convictions and scapegoated excuses, he could and did write a book that showed precisely these things. Like so many around him, Cervantes had been pulled from Madrid to Valladolid with the transfer of the royal court, hoping to benefit in some small way from the constant flurry of economic opportunity created by the monarchy's granting of favors and paid posts. As he looked around him at the rush to profit, though, he must have felt the sardonic resignation of a man who had himself too often followed this very route, only to be disappointed. A student and intellectual, he had escaped his homeland as a young man after wounding another man in a duel, and experienced firsthand the Spanish state's violent confrontations with Islam and the Mediterranean. Returning to Spain, a decorated hero, he had been captured by Barbary pirates and held in squalid captivity for 5 years, during which time he experienced both the depravities and the humanity of an enemy culture. Ransomed at last, he regained a homeland that seemed to have forgotten his sacrifices and that was intent on covering the patent failures of its domestic and foreign policy with a patchwork of religious fanaticism and ethnic scapegoating. Rebuffed and humiliated repeatedly in his quest for reward and recognition for his service, the aging warrior gradually turned back to his first love, writing, eventually producing Don Quixote along with a treasure trove of other great works. Ironically, it seems his unparalleled success was forged by a life of almost continuous failure. A century before Cervantes' birth, a time still fresh in people's memory, Spain was not even a nation, and kings were little more than local lords, scions of landowning families with deep ties to region, language, and local population, the population that tilled their lands and fed them in exchange for promises of protection from neighboring powers. In that time, people knew their place in the world. It was written into their flesh and spoken through their words and gestures, clothes and habitats, and the rituals that marked their births, marriages, and deaths. In the time since then, though, a man's place in the world had somehow become more mobile. New horizons opened up for exploration, and new possibilities for attaining a higher rung on the social ladder. But with that change came questions and uncertainties. Who to become? How to get there? How to survive? Cervantes' own grandfather had benefited from that new mobility, just as his father had suffered from the needs that it generated. The former, Juan de Cervantes, had been a well-regarded lawyer from a family of cloth merchants in Córdoba, a city that, while under Christian domination since the early 13th century, had been the capital of the Muslim Caliphate of Al-Andalus, and had long exemplified Spain's unique blend of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures. As a young man, newly married to the daughter of a Cordovan physician, he took a job as an assistant magistrate in Alcalá de Henares, north of Córdoba on the high plains of Castile. This is a beautiful 16th century painting of Alcalá, the view taken from outside of its walls. And here is a contemporary map, hand-painted, also from the Peabody collection, which I've centered Alcalá. It's hard to see from there, but it's bigger and more important at the time than Madrid would have been. Rodrigo, his second son and eventual father of Miguel, was born there in 1509, the same year that the Cardinal Francisco Jiménez Cisneros founded the city's university. Alcalá would become one of Spain's greatest centers of learning during the 16th century, second only in renown to Salamanca, and home of the first complete multilingual printed Bible. That Bible would henceforth be known as the Complutensian Polyglot Bible, in honor of the Latin name for Alcalá, Complutum. The University at Alcalá would later be moved to Madrid, where it is now the largest university in Spain and one of the largest in the world, the Universidad Complutense. Rodrigo's attempt to support his growing family as a surgeon in a university town where, as Cervantes would later write, quote, of the 5,000 students who studied that year at the university, 2,000 were studying medicine, clearly led to naught. His money problems followed him to Valladolid, where he tried to insinuate himself into a wealthier clientele by padding the family's lifestyle on borrowed funds. In the summer of 1552, only a few weeks before his daughter Magdalena was born, he was jailed for failing to pay his debts, and his property was impounded. It is during this stint in debtor's prison that Rodrigo tried to take advantages of the inequities governing Spanish society at the time by getting a court to rule that he was in fact of noble lineage and not subject to debtor laws. At first he was unable to establish a legal basis for this, and the court dismissed his suit. This initial failure to establish his exempt status raised the possibility that Cervantes' family, by and large educated and literate, and descending as they did from Cordovan merchants, had Jewish forebears. Back in Valladolid, toward the end of his own life, Cervantes cannot help but have reflected on his father's failures there, the lawsuits, the debts, the time spent in a prison whose forbidding walls he must have passed with frequency. He could also not have forgotten his own scrapes with the law, and especially the 2 months at least, maybe more, he spent among the wretched inhabitants of Seville's municipal jail. Indeed, it may have been in its dark cells that he dreamt up Don Quixote, which, as he tells us in his famous preface, was begotten in a prison where every discomfort has its place and every mournful sound makes its home. Now, almost 20 years later, the pages he gripped in his one good hand would complete their journey from captivity to freedom, from darkness to light, via the caustic wit of an inveterate gambler, adventurer, soldier, and storyteller, a man born on the threshold of a new world, who had learned the hard way that freeing oneself from history and tradition could lead to other sorts of bondage. As the criminalization of Spanish urban society took root over the second half of the 16th century, it was accompanied by the emergence of a genre of literature devoted to the social outcast and criminal deviant. What has been called the literature of roguery, or the picaresca, reached its acme in Europe at the end of the 16th century, and in Spain with the runaway success of Mateo Alemán's novel Guzmán de Alfarache, which was published simultaneously with the republication of the famous anonymous book that has been called the first picaresque novel, Lazarillo de Tormes. Lazarillo had been published in 1554, although the Spanish literary historian Americo Castro dates its composition to the 1530s. But the censorship of the Inquisition ensured that it would only be reprinted once before the end of the century, leading and in that reprinting, it was a highly, highly abridged version. Riding on the coattails of the Guzmán, however, the new edition of Lazarillo was an extraordinary success, leading to 9 different editions being in circulation by 1603. Guzmán had clearly tapped into a real desire on the part of Spanish readers to delve into the world of the underclasses, to experience it from the perspective of one of its own. Indeed, Alemán's book immediately sparked imitators, including a sequel by a Valencian lawyer named Juan Martí, of which 14 editions were printed before Mateo Alemán could come out with his own second part in 1604. The picaresque, as typified by the Guzmán and its followers, centered on a criminal life narrated by the criminal himself. The pícaro desires only freedom and the satisfaction of his basest desires, and he has no scruples about how to achieve his goals. When Guzmán encounters a sympathetic priest in Italy who takes him in and tries to help him, he repays the good man by robbing him and then loses all the money gambling. The fact that the genre became so popular just as urban criminality rose to unprecedented levels and Spanish society was responding with an ever-increasing legal and punitive bureaucracy should not be a surprise. Whereas the Inquisition censored Lazarillo de Tormes, such that the 1577 edition was printed without its 4th and 5th chapters, Guzmán, along with Lazarillo and other highly successful books, made it through the censors unscathed in the early years of the 17th century. It is clear that the portrayal of a social outcast and his parasitic perspective on society served the regime's purposes and the kind of image it wanted to project to the outside world. This image was that of a religious, moral public being beset by parasitic outsiders and whose only protection was their loyalty to the Spanish crown and its laws. At the same time, the reading public and members of acceptable Spanish society were titillated by the possibility of entering into the rogue's perspective and having their own prejudices about his evil and sociopathic ways confirmed. Sitting in a dank, stinking jail in Seville, choked by the smoke of oil lamps when lit at all, and surrounded by an unwashed mass of society's dregs, Cervantes spent many months, we don't know for sure, but perhaps up to a half of the year between 1597 and 98, savoring firsthand the perspectives of rogues and outcasts. Knowing the truth of his own story, a hero abandoned by his country, forced to accept whatever demeaning labor came his way, and then maligned, libeled, and imprisoned for his efforts, gave Cervantes a different kind of understanding of the lives of those who occupied society's bottom floors, and how they could contrast with the image painted of them by books and the stage. He could see in them the gamblers, tricksters, and hopeful social climbers that would populate his novels and tales, each and every one of them either battling against or profiting from the inability of others to see them for who they really were. In this world, people lived or died by the sword of illusion, and Cervantes, from the depths of his disillusion, was seeing that world clearly, perhaps for the first time. Don Quixote was published only a few years after Guzmán de Alfarache, but in this 22nd chapter, there's a clear reference to Mateo Alemán, the author of Guzmán de Alfarache, to Alemán's success in creating a whole new genre of literature. At the outset of that chapter, Don Quixote looks up to see, quote, coming toward him on the same road he was traveling, approximately 12 men on foot, strung together by their necks like beads on a great iron chain, and all of them wearing manacles. Asked by Quixote what they are, Sancho replies, this is a chain of galley slaves, people forced by the king to go to the galleys. What do you mean, forced? Quixote shoots back. Is it possible that the king forces anybody? When Sancho explains that they have been condemned to the galleys because of their crimes, Quixote concludes that, quote, because these people are being taken by force and not of their own free will, here it is fitting to put into practice my profession, to right wrongs and come to the aid and assistance of the wretched, end quote. Sancho quickly tries to clarify that as they are being punished for their crimes, it's not exactly accurate to say that the king is forcing or doing wrong to them. But Quixote ignores him and proceeds, upon receiving permission from the guards, to talk to several of the men. Each describes to him the crime of greater or lesser severity that led to his having been condemned to the galleys. The last one Quixote interrogates is a certain Ginés de Pasamonte, who, the guards tell the knight, is famous on account of the book he has written about his life. When Quixote asks if the book is finished, Ginés replies, how can it be finished if my life isn't finished yet? Having finished his interrogation of the prisoners, Quixote decides that it is indeed his duty to free them all. But after he has attacked the guards and released their charges, he is rewarded for his mercy by being stoned by them before they run off in different directions. Thus, at the simplest level, the episode would appear to be sending a similar message to that of the Guzman or any of its followers. These are criminals. They are different from you and me. Don't feel pity on them. And indeed, should Cervantes have written an episode in which prisoners on the way to the galley were shown as truly deserving of their fate, it would certainly have fallen afoul of the censors and gotten Cervantes himself in hot water. What he did, though, was far more astute. By making the principal prisoner an obvious stand-in for the literary character Guzman de Alfarache, who himself ends up being condemned to the galleys, Cervantes is telling his reading public not that prisoners are evil and deserve no pity, but that what they think they know about prisoners and outlaws is nothing but illusions made up for their own entertainment. The other prisoners who tell their tales before being overshadowed by Ginés are a hodgepodge of minor sad characters, an old man serving as a go-between who was suspected of sorcery, another who had stolen some laundry, one who failed to withstand trial by ordeal, another who had sexual relations with his relative, but all of them convicted on shady or suspect evidence. Only the literary character, only Ginés de Pasamonte, is an obvious villain, for only, Cervantes seems to be saying, only a fiction would be so obviously guilty. In Cervantes' tales, when scallywags and scullions turn out to have been people of quality, these revelations undermine the very idea of a rapacious but alien underclass that was being spread by the literature known as the picaresca. Rogues are the projections of the fears and desires of an established social order. Criminality is not something they do. It is stitched into the very fabric of society, up to and including the highest echelons of political and ecclesiastic power. The Cervantes who emerged from months of imprisonment in 1598 was a changed man. This was the man who would around that time start writing what would soon be published as Don Quixote, along with some of the stories he would later publish in his collection of exemplary novels. Regardless of whether the writing began in prison or shortly thereafter, the experiences he accumulated in prison had an enormous impact on the period of creativity that was to follow. But those experiences influenced him in other ways as well. The Cervantes who emerged from that prison no longer believed in the idea that Spanish society and its government had been selling his entire life. While he had encountered many reasons to doubt the official story over the course of the previous 20 years, having been thrown into prison for doing his job for his government was the last straw. The Cervantes who would, as would be expected from a poet of renown, publish an ode in honor of Philip II upon his death later that year, would no longer write the kind of laudatory verse he had produced for the death of Elizabeth of Valois 30 years earlier, or even for the felicitous Armada 10 years earlier. The poem published for Philip's death was a masterpiece of critical irony, depicting not the greatness of Philip, but a man pompously declaring the greatness of Philip, his speech then quickly seconded by someone Cervantes describes as a bully, who calls it true, accuses all who would question it as lying like dogs, and then furtively glances both ways before slipping away. It makes sense that Cervantes, while inspired by Alemán's remarkable success with the newly popular genre of the picaresque, would engage that literature in an entirely different way from those around him. Cervantes, who had tried to live by the rules and follow the ideology of the Spanish state, who had been disappointed and rebuffed at every turn, who had spent 5 years among the infidels and come to know their ways, who had learned the techniques of the theater and used them to analyze how humans buy into illusions and work to keep them alive, and who had now lived on the other side of the law and had experienced for himself. This Cervantes understood that the pícaro, like every other category of his society, or that his society promulgated for understanding the world, was a farce, an invention, an illusion whose purpose was to ensure that the crown's subjects kept buying into the myth of their own superiority, and that their dependence on the state for their protection. He couldn't say all of this in so many words, but he could use the tools he handled best to try to get that message across in legally and politically viable ways. And so he made his stories about society's outcasts be stories, in fact, about the fictional framework that made them outcasts in the first place. The man who walked the streets of his nation's capital on that hot August day knew that he had written something good. He also certainly understood that it was something new, which he tells us himself in several places. There is no way, however, that either he or anyone else could have predicted what would happen starting in January of the following year, when the press of Juan de la Cuesta, the Madrid-based printer whom Francisco de Robles hired to produce the actual book, would release the first of what would be countless editions of the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha. Within a few months of its original publication, Cervantes needed to apply for a new license to have the book distributed throughout the Iberian Peninsula, and Robles and de la Cuesta began to work on a second edition to be released that same summer. Before that edition hit the bookstores, 2 pirated editions appeared in London, along with 2 others in Valencia and Zaragoza. Already by April, Robles was spending a good part of his time preparing legal suits against the purveyors of pirated copies. Within only a few months, stacks of copies were loaded onto the galleons embarking from Seville for the New World. And by June of the same year, the book's protagonists, the deluded Don Quixote and his squat and simple sidekick Sancho Panza, had become iconic figures. Their effigies carried in parades and imitators popping up in celebrations, both royal and plebeian. Upon seeing a student doubled up in raucous laughter one day, King Philip III was reported to have said, "That student is either out of his mind or he's reading the story of Don Quixote." Cervantes' newfound fame was not limited to the Spanish world. Spain's cultural influence at the time was as widespread as its political and military presence, and Spanish works were regularly disseminated and translated in England, France, and Germany, not to mention in the Netherlands and Italy, which were still under Spanish control. Brussels saw 2 editions released by 1611. Figures dressed as Don Quixote and Sancho appeared at a procession in Heidelberg in 1613, and in England, John Fletcher and Francis Beaumont adapted one of the novel's interpolated stories into their play The Coxcomb, written between 1608 and 1610. In 1612, Thomas Shelton published his enormously successful English translation, The History of the Valorous and Witty Knight-Errant Don Quixote of La Mancha, and although it has been lost, sadly, William Shakespeare joined forces with John Fletcher to write a play called Cardenio that was inspired by another famous episode from the novel. From its publication in the early days of 1605 to the present, Don Quixote has become perhaps the most published work of literature in history. More than that, its influence on the writers that have followed has been unparalleled. In the words of the critic Harold Bloom, Don Quixote is a novel that, quote, contains within itself all the novels that have followed in its sublime wake. When the Norwegian Nobel Institute polled the 100 leading fiction writers to name the single most important work of literature in history, more than half of them named Don Quixote. No other author's work came close. In 1997, Life magazine declared the book's publication one of the 100 most important events of the entire millennium. If Cervantes' direct influence on the history of literature is unparalleled, his indirect influence on intellectual history is simply immeasurable. His books were to be found on the shelves of every intellectual in early modern Europe, and many in the Americas as well. In 19th century England, a critic could take great umbrage at a fellow scholar's inadequate translation of Don Quixote, writing, quote, "What judgment I formed of you and your abilities as an editor of Don Quixote," that's how it's pronounced in England, of course, "may easily be guessed by this first token you gave me of them. It was plain that your book would prove perfectly useless to all classes of readers, and even hurtful to all learners of that tongue, if you were to be its corrector." And the stories of the Don and his squire were packaged into all shapes and sizes, including for the youngest readers. And I'm going to skip over a few slides because I had to cut out a few pages of my presentation. So this is one abridged and adapted to youthful by this is the Sir Marvelous Crack Joke. This is a late 19th century edition. Let me show you some of the artwork, and the plates are really marvelous here. And the colors are, they're even on the screen, not even close to what you see if you hold the edition in your hand. This, we presume, is Quixote himself with his lance at the ready, buried in his books at the beginning of the novel. Mm. While writers like Fielding and Flaubert and philosophers like Schelling and Hegel have put down for posterity what they thought of Cervantes, his indirect influence on thinkers like Locke, Descartes, Kant, and countless others whose ideas would lay the foundations for how modern individuals and societies understand themselves, was just as profound. In 1787, and this is fitting that in this building, or in the building at least next door, we would mention this, Thomas Jefferson wrote to a nephew about the Spanish language that he should, quote, bestow great attention on this and endeavor to acquire an accurate knowledge of it. Our future connection with Spain and Spanish America will render that language a valuable acquisition. While he no doubt meant his admonitions about geopolitics, Jefferson's own interest in Spanish culture, in fact, came from his fascination with Don Quixote, which he had borrowed from John Cabot in advance of a sea voyage to France in 1784 and used alongside a Spanish dictionary to master the language during his 19-day voyage. This was noted by John Quincy Adams in a journal entry he jotted down after a dinner with Jefferson in 1804, although Adams then adds a little note, quote, but Mr. Jefferson tells large stories. What is undeniable, though, is the importance Jefferson placed on the novel, of which he owned several copies that one can still see at Monticello, and which he mentions dozens of times in his letters over the years. What took hold of his imagination, like it did with that of so many men and women, was that central idea of reality's pliability in the face of political interests. As he wrote in a pensive letter to Edmund Randolph, who would have conceived in 1789 that within 10 years we should have to combat such windmills? End quote. Jefferson's comment, as superficial as it seems, nevertheless leaves us a clue as to why Cervantes' invention had the impact it did. With the publication of Don Quixote, Cervantes had managed at once to encapsulate a problem that had been encroaching on Western culture for some time and to offer a way forward. The problem was that of how to freely exercise the imagination in a culture that strictly controlled such expressions by dictating the norms of truth. The solution was the creation of a new form of writing that exempted itself from the narrowest conception of truth at the same time as it revealed an even greater truth, that reality itself was subject to political distortions, and that to change the world one had to reveal these for what they were. In 1995, UNESCO declared April 23rd, the International Day of the Book, at least partly in recognition of the almost simultaneous deaths in 1616 of two of the greatest writers of all time. That the deaths of William Shakespeare and Miguel de Cervantes neither coincided. The former died some 10 days later, but England at the time had not yet adopted the Gregorian calendar we use today, nor actually fell on April 23rd. Cervantes probably died the previous day and was buried on that date, later etched into posterity, bestows on that date a fitting irony. The Day of the Book celebrates those who write fiction, the glorious art of facts that aren't, histories that didn't happen, and lies that reveal the truths papered over by the habits of everyday life. Both Cervantes and his greatest character die quietly in their beds, surrounded by their loved ones. But whereas the knight of the mournful countenance admits defeat and renounces fantasy for a death of stolid virtue, his author's mighty imagination lived on in ways no one could have predicted, and that few even grasp today. On April 18, 1616, Cervantes was given his last rites at home in Madrid, surrounded by his wife and his sisters, although not his daughter, Isabel. A dedication to the Count of Lemos he composed the next day begins with the words, quote, "With my foot already placed in the stirrup, and full of fear in the face of death, great Lord, I write this. Yesterday they gave me extreme unction, and today I write these words. Time is short, my anguish grows, my hopes diminish, and yet, despite all this, I carry on my life with the desire I have to keep living." Desire against reality. The theme that resonates throughout his greatest creations comes to the fore in his last statement to the world. Critics have made much of the fact that Don Quixote renounces his madness on his deathbed, cursing the passion for the books of chivalry that drove him out of his sanity and embracing his real name, Alonso Quijano the Good. They have insisted that this ending, along with Cervantes' apparent protestations that his only purpose in writing the book was to skewer the romances of chivalry, should put to rest any suspicions that Don Quixote can mean anything other than that. But these critics, it seems to me, fail to get his last joke. It is as if they really believed that the only alternative to this reduction of the extraordinary wealth of the world's first and greatest work of modern fiction would be to interpret it as expressing the opposing thesis that somehow we, Cervantes' readers then and now, should be emulating the tales of chivalry. But the meaning of Don Quixote cannot be either Cervantes' distaste for or his love of the tales of chivalry. Indeed, asking what Don Quixote means, as if such a shorthand answer could ever be given, already misses the boat entirely. If we really want to know, let us attend to the deathbed scene our author composed only a year or so before his own. Approaching their village in the twilight hours of their adventure together, the heroes pause on a hillside overlooking their home. When he saw it, Sancho dropped to his knees and said, "Open your eyes, my beloved country, and see that your son Sancho Panza has come back to you, if not very rich, at least well flogged. Open your arms and receive as well your son Don Quixote, who, though he returns conquered by another, returns the conqueror of himself. And as he has told me, that is the greatest conquest anyone can desire. To conquer oneself, to rein in the force of desire, the pull of illusion. This, more than the imminence of death, is what Quixote fears and foresees, crying, 'Malum signum,' as he enters the village. For passing two boys in the street, he overhears their patter and he misinterprets the sentence, 'You won't see it in all the days of your life,' as referring to his imaginary lady, Dulcinea. As he has learned to do, Sancho hastens to reassure his friend. Strangely, though, this time his down-to-earth realism in the face of Quixote's superstitions is intended to save his illusions, not to dispel them. He gathers from under his donkey the terrified hare, whose flight from a pack of dogs Don Quixote first took as an evil omen, a malum signum, and carefully hands this shuddering, shaking hare to his master, saying, 'Your grace is a puzzle. Let's suppose that this hare is Dulcinea of Toboso, and these greyhounds chasing her are the wicked enchanters who changed her into peasants. She flees, I catch her and turn her over to your grace, who holds her and cares for her. What kind of sign is that? What kind of evil omen can you find here? How far we have come since Sancho sought to set a windmill battered Quixote right in his saddle and straight in his interpretation of reality. For Sancho, over the course of his journeys and travails imposed on him, has learned to love not only Quixote the man, but also the world Quixote has dreamed for himself. If he followed the errant knight out of a fool's wish to govern an insula, his desire to shelter his master's illusions at the twilight of their adventures seems born of wiser sentiments, almost noble. A few days later, Alonso Quijano, having fallen ill and now under the loving care of his niece and housekeeper, loudly declares that he is cured of his illusions, renounces the tales of chivalry, and calls for a confessor and a scribe to take down his will. Immediately those around him, especially his friends Sanson Carrasco and Sancho Panza, begin to protest that he is wrong. And how can he say such things? Quote, when we have news of the disenchantment of Lady Dulcinea, and now that we're on the point of becoming like shepherds and spending our lives in song, like princes, now your grace wishes to become a hermit? For God's sake, be quiet, come to your senses, and tell us no more tales. While the knight urges reason, his companions know that such realism is madness. They realize that he is giving up the essence of who he is and has become. Even as reality tightens its noose, the urge to be free reasserts itself. The narrator, our supposed ventriloquist of the Arab historian, Cide Hamete Benengeli, then tells us that the news of his impending death, quote, put terrible pressure on the already full eyes of his housekeeper, his niece and his good squire, Sancho Panza, forcing tears from their eyes and 1,000 deep sighs from their bosoms, because the truth is, as has already been said, that whether Don Quixote was simply Alonso Quijano, or whether he was Don Quixote of La Mancha, he always had a gentle disposition, was kind in his treatment of others, and for that reason he was dearly loved, not only by those in his household, but by everyone who knew him. Just as a character, Don Quixote, had espoused and emulated the tales of chivalry, another character, Alonso Quijano, abjures them. Deciding that one is right and the other wrong is exactly what Cervantes' book doesn't allow us to do. For the space it opens, the space of fiction, is one in which exactly those questions can never be resolved. Because the space of fiction does not refer to the reality in question, to the place where either books of chivalry are evil or they are harmless, fun. The space of fiction refers to that place where such debates take place and where we are called upon to make a judgment about them and about ourselves. Whether Quixote was Quijano or Quijano Quixote, Cervantes seems to be telling his present-day interpreters, he was still good, one way or the other. And so, in a last joke on his readers, Cervantes has the priest draw up a document stating for posterity that, quote, Alonso Quijano the Good, commonly known as Don Quixote, had passed from his life and died a natural death, and that he, and only he, could ever be recognized as his author. But of course, Cervantes didn't name himself as that author, but someone else, the fictional historian Cide Hamete Benengeli, whose historical account has ostensibly been the source of the book and whose ode to his own pen now ends it. Here is the ode. For me alone was Don Quixote born, and I for him. He knew how to act, and I to write. The two of us alone are one. So, idle listeners, as Cervantes might say, if you really want to believe that, as the author writes one last time, quote, my only desire has been to have people reject and despise the false and nonsensical books of chivalry, end quote. By all means, be my guest. After all, it's Cide Hamete who told you so himself, and he always tells the truth. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Professor Egginton will take some questions. And I want to remind you also that we'll have books on sale and we'll be signing copies.
I read your book and I liked it very much. The fact that it's jargon-free and very able to understand to a general reader. And I also appreciated the fact that it was context-centric, text-centric, not context-centric. It was focused more on the Quixote itself and just illuminate the cultural history of Spain to shed light on the book. So I thought that was refreshing as well. And my question to you is, have you ever thought of the economic relationships in the book and how this correlates to violence and peace in the book?
Thank you, and thank you for the nice comments on the book. I mean, to a certain extent, as you know, since you've read it, I try and balance this analysis of what fiction is and how it came about at this particular time with this larger geopolitical history of a kind of pivotal moment in Western history, not just in Spanish history, but where the Spanish Empire was also playing a pivotal role. And of course that role is economic to a certain extent. I mean, we discuss in the book the question of inflation, for example, that racked the Spanish economy, leading to maybe over the course of Philip and his son and his grandson, 6 bankruptcies of the Spanish crown. And these clearly had a direct impact on Cervantes' life. The question of debt is constant in Cervantes' writing. As you know, gambling is obviously an economic issue as well, and Cervantes was, as I say at one point in this reading today, an inveterate gambler. And he shows enormous knowledge about the gambling world and the skills that card players in particular need. And I'm sure he played a lot in prison, surrounded by people who were put there for economic crimes as well. And he was a tax collector for a time in his life, and a requisitioner for the Armada. So he was deeply embedded in this massive, blooming, early modern imperial economy with all of its incredible ups and downs. Thanks for the question.
I appreciated how much you pointed out that Don Quixote is indisputably influential and much loved in the Western world, and that it reflects Spain at that time. And it's a very rich book, but I'm going to just look at one particular aspect of it. You said at the beginning, Don Quixote, geriatric person, also a geezer.
Yeah.
Okay, I was wondering what was the reception of Don Quixote depicted that way in East Asia, for example, Native America, for example, where I don't think such a character would be part of their culture.
Yeah, no, it's quite possible. And in fact, our reception, if you think about it, if you kind of reconstruct the history and the age, Quixote, much like Cervantes at the time that he's writing Quixote, would have been, from our perspective, a middle-aged man. Right? But the period when if you've made it to your late 50s or early 60s, you're an outlier.